Imagine standing on the deck of an aircraft carrier, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The year is 1942, the Pacific is on fire, and the entire future of the free world is about to be decided not by armies, not by politicians, not even by admirals sitting in safe rooms far away from the front lines, but by a handful of young men flying outdated planes into the most dangerous skies on Earth. 5 minutes. That is all it took. Just 5 extraordinary, chaotic, terrifying minutes to change the entire course of World War II. 5 dive bombers, a few thousand feet of open air, and a decision made in the blink of an eye by men who had no idea they were about to rewrite history. This is the Battle of Midway. And if you have never heard the full story, if you have only caught the headlines or seen the Hollywood version, then settle in. Because what actually happened out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in June of 1942 is so dramatic, so improbable, so layered with human courage and human error, that even today, more than 80 years later, military historians and naval strategists still shake their heads in quiet disbelief. Before we get to those 5 minutes, before we zoom in to that tiny window of time that changed everything, we need to understand the world that created this moment. We need to go back, not just to the beginning of the battle, but to the beginning of the crisis itself. Because the Battle of Midway did not happen in a vacuum. It was the product of months of fear, months of failure, and months of desperate American scrambling in the wake of one of the most catastrophic days in United States military history. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. You already know the name. But think about what it actually meant in the days and weeks that followed. The United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 250 aircraft lost. More than 2,400 Americans killed before breakfast. The Japanese had struck with a precision and a ferocity that left the American military establishment in a state of shock that it had never experienced before and has rarely experienced since. The assumption before Pearl Harbor was that the United States Navy was a force that no adversary in Asia would dare challenge so directly, so boldly, so successfully. That assumption was gone now, shattered along with the battleships resting on the floor of Pearl Harbor. In the months that followed December 7th, the news from the Pacific got worse before it got better. The Philippines fell. Guam fell. Wake Island fell. British forces surrendered Singapore in what Winston Churchill himself called the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. The Japanese Empire was expanding at a speed that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled a vast arc of territory stretching from the borders of India all the way to the edges of the Central Pacific. Their navy was the most powerful in the ocean. Their pilots were among the most experienced in the world, many of them veterans of years of combat in China. Their carriers were fast, well-designed, and crewed by men who had spent years training for exactly this kind of war. And America? America was trying to rebuild. America was grieving. America was angry. But anger and grief do not sink aircraft carriers. And in the spring of 1942, the hard truth was that the United States was losing the war in the Pacific. Not slowly, not in some distant theoretical sense. Actually losing. Actively, concretely, measurably losing. So the question that hung over every meeting in Washington, over every briefing in Pearl Harbor, over every conversation between Admiral Ernest King and his commanders, was this: where is Japan going next? Because if Japan could be stopped, if the momentum of their expansion could be checked somewhere, anywhere, then maybe the United States could buy enough time to rebuild, to rearm, to train the pilots and build the ships that would eventually be needed to take the fight back across the Pacific. But if Japan kept winning, kept expanding, kept pushing the boundaries of their already enormous empire further and further east, then the consequences were almost too dark to contemplate. Now here is where the story gets extraordinary, and I mean that in the most literal sense of the word. Because the key to understanding the Battle of Midway, the key to understanding how a nation that had been knocked to its knees just 6 months earlier managed to win one of the most decisive naval battles in human history, lies not in the bravery of the pilots, not in the firepower of the ships, and not in the strategies of the admirals, though all of those things matter enormously. The key lies in a group of men sitting in a basement. Station HYPO. That was the name of the Signals Intelligence Unit located in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Led by a brilliant and deeply eccentric naval officer named Commander Joseph Rockefort, this small team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and intelligence specialists had spent months working to crack the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. It was painstaking work, frustrating work, the kind of work that requires you to sit with enormous ambiguity and uncertainty for weeks at a time, while holding the weight of knowing that lives depend on your getting it right. Rockefort was not an easy man to work with. He wore a smoking jacket and slippers to work. He sometimes went days without sleeping. He had a mind that could hold seemingly unrelated fragments of information and rotate them until they snapped together into a pattern that no one else had seen. By the spring of 1942, Rockefort and his team had broken enough of JN-25 to understand something crucial. Japan was planning a major operation in the Central Pacific. The target was identified in Japanese communications only by the code designation AF. The question was, what was AF? The Japanese were careful. Their codes were complicated. Even with the partial breaks that Rockefort's team had achieved, there was still enormous uncertainty. And in Washington, there was real skepticism. Some intelligence officials believed AF was somewhere else entirely. Australia, perhaps, or even the west coast of the United States. Rockefort was convinced AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands roughly halfway between North America and Asia, sitting in the middle of the Pacific like a small, isolated, strategically invaluable dot on a very large map. He needed proof. And so he and his team came up with one of the most elegant intelligence operations of the entire war. They instructed the small American garrison on Midway to send a radio message in plain, uncoded English reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. The message was sent. Within 48 hours, Japanese communications traffic began reporting that AF was experiencing a water shortage. Rockefort had his proof. AF was Midway. This moment, this quiet little act of deception in a basement at Pearl Harbor, was the first of the hidden turning points of the Battle of Midway. Because Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew not just where the Japanese were going, but roughly when they were going there and with how many ships. He had a window, a narrow and dangerous window, but a window nonetheless, to prepare a trap. Let us talk about the Japanese plan, because to understand the magnitude of what happened at Midway, you need to understand how confident Japan was going into this battle. The architect of the Midway operation was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, arguably the most brilliant naval strategist of his generation and a man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto understood something that many of his colleagues did not. Japan could not win a long war against the United States. Japan's industrial base was too small, her oil reserves too limited, her manpower too stretched across too vast a territory. Japan's only hope of securing a favorable peace was to strike decisively, early, before the American industrial machine could fully shift into war production, and to destroy the remaining American carrier fleet in a single decisive engagement. Midway was designed to accomplish exactly that. The plan was, on paper, a work of strategic genius. Japan would send a diversionary force north to attack the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, drawing American attention and resources away from the Central Pacific. Then the main force, built around four of Japan's most powerful fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, would steam toward Midway and initiate an assault that would force the American carriers to come out and fight. When they did, Yamamoto's immense surface fleet, including the giant battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built at that time, would be waiting to annihilate them. With the American carrier force destroyed, Japan would be free to fortify Midway as a forward base, extend their defensive perimeter, and negotiate a peace on terms favorable to Tokyo. It was a bold plan, a sophisticated plan, a plan that any objective observer studying it in isolation would have said had a very high probability of success. There was just one problem. Nimitz knew it was coming. The American response to the Japanese plan was built around a simple and brutal reality. The United States Navy at that moment had exactly 3 carriers available in the Pacific. The Hornet and the Enterprise were operational. The Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, and by standard assessment, she needed at least 3 months of repairs in dry dock before she could fight again. Nimitz needed her in 2 weeks. What happened at Pearl Harbor's dry dock in the last days of May 1942 is one of the great engineering feats of the war and one of the least told stories of the entire Battle of Midway. Some 1,400 workers, working around the clock in 3 shifts, performing repairs that should have taken months in just under 72 hours. Welders and electricians and damage control specialists working in tight, dark, smoke-filled spaces, sleeping in shifts beside their tools, eating sandwiches handed to them through hatches because there was no time to stop. They did not fully fix the Yorktown. She was still damaged when she left dry dock. Her hull still groaned with the stress of the Coral Sea battle. But she could float, she could move, and most importantly, she could fly aircraft off her deck. And that was all Nimitz needed. By the end of May 1942, Task Force 16, built around the Enterprise and the Hornet, and Task Force 17, built around the wounded Yorktown, were steaming northwest from Pearl Harbor toward a position northeast of Midway that Nimitz and his carrier commander, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, had designated Point Luck. The name was partly tactical, the rendezvous coordinates, and partly acknowledgement of the reality they were all living in. They were going to need some luck. Now I want you to picture the American pilots who were part of this force, because they are the human heart of this story, and their story is not a simple or a comfortable one. The United States Navy in the spring of 1942 had a severe shortage of experienced carrier aviators. The training pipeline had been expanded dramatically after Pearl Harbor, but training takes time, and time was the one commodity that the Pacific Fleet did not have. Many of the pilots who flew at Midway were young men with limited combat experience flying aircraft that were, in several critical respects, inferior to their Japanese counterparts. The TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, for example, was an aircraft that naval experts had known for at least a year was dangerously obsolete. It was slow. It had poor altitude performance. Its Mk-13 torpedoes were plagued by reliability problems so severe that they had essentially been the subject of informal complaints from naval aviators for months. Complaints that had been buried in bureaucratic processes that prioritized operational security over operational effectiveness. The men flying these aircraft knew they were flying into battle in machines that might not give them a fighting chance. They flew anyway. The SBD, Dauntless Dive Bomber, was a different story. Not glamorous, not fast, not the kind of aircraft that inspired recruiting posters, but sturdy, reliable, with a diving accuracy that its pilots had honed through thousands of hours of practice. The Dauntless pilots trusted their aircraft. They trusted their training. What they did not trust, as June 4th, 1942 approached, was their luck. Early in the morning of June 4th, the Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway itself. 108 aircraft sweeping toward the island in the gray pre-dawn light, their pilots experienced and disciplined, their formations tight and professional. The American defenders on Midway scrambled everything they had, a mixed collection of aircraft including obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and the newer Grumman Wildcats, along with the torpedo bombers and dive bombers of Marine Air Group 22. The air battle over Midway was savage and almost entirely one-sided. The American defenders flew with extraordinary courage. They were torn apart. 17 of the 25 fighters that Midway sent up were shot down. The Japanese strike damaged facilities on the island significantly, though not enough to put the airfield out of operation. Here is where Japanese Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force from his flagship Akagi, faced his first critical decision of the battle. His planes returned from Midway reporting that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize the island's defenses before a landing could be made. At the same time, Nagumo was receiving reports of American aircraft attacking his carriers. the Midway-based plane striking at his force in a series of attacks that were brave and determined and almost entirely unsuccessful in hitting their targets, but which were also telling him something important. The Americans knew he was there. The question was whether the Americans had any carriers in the area. That question should have been answered by Japanese search planes launched at dawn, but here the Japanese plan began to show its first cracks. A critical search plane from the cruiser Tone had launched late, delayed by a catapult malfunction, and its search sector was precisely the one that covered the area where the American carriers were waiting. The delayed plane had not yet reached the American force when Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft on his carriers, which had been armed with torpedoes in case American surface ships or carriers were found, to be rearmed with bombs for a second strike on Midway. This was not an irrational decision given the information Nagumo had at the time, but it was a fateful one, because while the Japanese flight deck crews began the laborious process of pulling torpedoes off aircraft and replacing them with bombs, while the carriers' hangar decks became crowded with weapons and fuel lines and the compressed, dangerous business of rearming dozens of aircraft at once, the Tone's delayed search plane finally reached the American fleet. At 7:28 in the morning, Nagumo received the message he had most feared. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. 10 minutes later came a follow-up that stopped his heart. One of them appeared to be a carrier. Now Nagumo faced a decision of nightmarish complexity. His strike aircraft were in the process of being rearmed with bombs. His first strike was returning from Midway and needed to land, because they were low on fuel. His combat air patrol, the Zeros protecting his carriers from air attack, had been flying continuous missions since dawn and needed fuel and ammunition. And somewhere to the northeast, closing the distance with every passing minute, there was at least one American carrier armed and ready to strike him. He decided to wait. He would recover his returning aircraft. He would finish rearming. He would respot his strike aircraft on the flight decks and launch a coordinated, overwhelming attack on the American fleet. It would take time, perhaps an hour, perhaps a little more, but it would give him a strike force powerful enough to deal decisively with whatever the Americans had. That hour was the hour that destroyed the Japanese Empire's hopes of victory. While Nagumo was making his decisions, the American carriers were launching their strike aircraft. And here the chaos of battle, the fog of war, the thousand little malfunctions and miscommunications and navigational errors that define any real combat operation, began producing results that no one on either side had planned. The American air groups from the three carriers were supposed to coordinate their attacks, arriving over the Japanese fleet at roughly the same time to overwhelm the defenses. Instead, the groups became separated. Navigation was difficult over the open ocean. Aircraft from different carriers headed toward where they thought the Japanese fleet was and found empty ocean. Some turned south, some turned north. The torpedo bomber squadrons from the Hornet, 15 TBD Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 under the command of Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, found the Japanese fleet, but found it alone, without fighter escort, without the dive bombers that were supposed to follow them in and suppress the anti-aircraft fire. What happened next is one of the most heartbreaking episodes in the history of American naval aviation. Waldron led his squadron in at low altitude, slow, the Devastators lumbering through a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zero fighters. They had no fighter cover. Their aircraft were too slow to evade the Zeros. Their torpedoes, when the few pilots who made it close enough actually dropped them, ran too deep or too slow and failed to find their targets. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Waldron's plane went in early, perhaps first. He left a letter before the battle to his pilots telling them that he had thought about this mission deeply and he believed they would all come back. He was wrong. Of the 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8, not one returned. Of the 30 men who flew that attack, 30 men who knew what they were flying into and flew in anyway, exactly one survived. Ensign George Gay, shot down and floating in the water on a floating seat cushion, watched the rest of the battle from the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise followed, with similar results. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown followed them. The toll was devastating. Of the 41 devastators that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 returned. Dozens of American airmen died, and all of the Japanese carriers remained untouched. But here is the thing, the extraordinary, almost unbelievable thing, that those men accomplished in dying. They accomplished it without knowing they were accomplishing it. They could not have known. In order to defend against the low-altitude torpedo attacks, the Japanese carriers had altered course repeatedly, maneuvering hard to avoid the torpedoes. The Zero Combat Air Patrol had been pulled down to low altitude to deal with the devastators, their fuel running low, their altitude now all wrong for defending against an attack from above. The flight decks of the carriers were crowded with aircraft, with fuel, with bombs and torpedoes that had been removed from aircraft, and then in some cases were being put back on. And the men at Nagumo's headquarters were watching these low-level attacks, wave after wave of them, and thinking, against all odds, that they had survived, that the worst was past, that in just a few more minutes their strike aircraft would be ready and the battle would turn in their favor. It was at this moment, approximately 10:22 in the morning of June 4, 1942, that Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bomber groups from the Enterprise, arrived over empty ocean where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be and found nothing. McCluskey had made a critical decision earlier in the flight that nearly ended the battle before it began. His group had flown the calculated intercept course and found nothing. He had 2 choices. He could turn back toward the Enterprise, preserving his aircraft and his pilots' lives, but sacrificing the attack. Or he could search. He was already beyond the range at which he was confident of making it back, already burning fuel that the math said he did not have. He turned to search. He saw, by chance or fortune or whatever word you use for the things that happen in war that cannot be fully explained, the wake of a Japanese destroyer moving at high speed toward the northwest, a destroyer hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after being detached to investigate a contact. He followed it. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey's dive bombers reached the Japanese carrier force. Below them, for fleet carriers, their flight decks packed with aircraft, their Zero Combat Air Patrol at low altitude and low fuel, their crews exhausted and unaware. McCluskey called the attack. The dive bombers rolled over. I need you to try to picture this moment the way the men who were there described it. Not from the air, not from the perspective of the pilots rolling their aircraft over into the 70-degree dives they had trained for, though that is extraordinary enough. Picture it from the deck of the Akagi. Picture the Japanese sailors who had been at battle stations since before dawn, who had watched wave after wave of American aircraft come in low and slow and be shot to pieces by the Zeros and the anti-aircraft guns, who had begun in the last half hour to feel, if not safe, at least less endangered. They were professionals. They were experienced. They had survived Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean and every engagement since. They looked up. They saw nothing. The SBD Dauntless dives at 70 degrees, and the first indication you typically have that it is coming is the scream of its engine as it approaches. By the time you see it, it is already too late. In the space of approximately 6 minutes, the course of the Second World War in the Pacific was decided. 3 dive bombers hit the Akagi, starting fires that spread to the aircraft on the hangar deck and detonated the improperly stored ordnance that Nagumo's crew had been in the middle of moving when the attack came. 3 bombs on the Kaga started similar fires. The Soryu was hit by a separate group from the Yorktown. Within minutes, all 3 carriers were burning out of control. Nagumo had to be physically restrained from going down with his flagship. He was transferred to a destroyer, unwilling, furious, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, 3 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months before, were out of action and sinking. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, survived the initial attack and immediately launched a counterstrike that found and badly damaged the Yorktown. The Yorktown's crew performed damage control miracles, getting their ship moving again so quickly that when the second Japanese strike arrived, the Hiryu's pilots reported they were attacking a different, undamaged carrier. The Yorktown was eventually abandoned and later finished off by a Japanese submarine, the only American carrier lost in the battle. But the Hiryu herself was found by American dive bombers in the late afternoon, struck by 4 bombs, and set afire. By morning, she too had sunk. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. The equivalent, in terms of air power and training and experience, took years to replace. The experienced aircrew who died at Midway, the mechanics, the ordnance specialists, the fighter pilots who had been flying combat missions since the war in China, these were resources that Japan simply could not reproduce quickly. Japan's naval air arm never fully recovered from Midway. It could be rebuilt in ships. It could not be rebuilt in men, not at the pace that the war now required. In the weeks and months after Midway, the strategic reality of the Pacific War shifted in ways that became clearer only with time. Japan retained enormous strength. The fighting ahead was years of brutal, costly, island-by-island struggle across the vast distances of the Pacific. The battles of Guadalcanal, of the Philippine Sea, of Leyte Gulf were all still to come. Tens of thousands of Americans would still die. But after Midway, Japan was never again able to seize the strategic initiative. Every campaign from Midway onward was fought with Japan reacting to American moves rather than making its own. The perimeter Japan had established in the first 6 months of the war began, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, to contract. There are a few things about the Battle of Midway that I want to dwell on in the time we have left, because the standard telling of the battle, the one that focuses on those 6 minutes and the famous dive, can obscure some of the deeper lessons of what happened out there. The first is about intelligence and the willingness to act on it. Nimitz had the code-breaking intelligence. He had Rockefeller's analysis. He had, as much as any commander at that stage of the war could have had it, the ability to anticipate his enemy's intentions. But intelligence is only useful if a commander is willing to act on it, willing to place his diminished, wounded fleet in a position of extreme risk on the basis of information that could, in the worst case, turn out to be wrong. If Nagumo's target had not been Midway, if the intelligence had been incorrect, if Yamamoto had somehow changed his plan at the last minute, Nimitz's 3 carriers would have been sitting in exactly the right position to be caught by the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Nimitz knew this. He sent them anyway. That willingness to act on uncertain intelligence, to make the calculated bet rather than the safe choice, is what made Nimitz one of the great commanders of the war. The second lesson is about the role of ordinary men in extraordinary moments. The pilots of the torpedo squadrons who died that morning, Waldron and his 30 men and the dozens of others who followed them in their obsolete, slow aircraft, did not win the Battle of Midway in any conventional tactical sense. Their attacks failed. Their torpedoes did not strike their targets. They died, many of them, in the same few minutes. But their attacks kept the Japanese carriers occupied. Their attacks kept the Zeros low and fast and burning fuel. Their attacks created the narrow window of disorganization and distraction in which McCluskey's dive bombers arrived. There is a line of causality that runs directly from the deaths of Torpedo Squadron 8 to the sinking of the Akagi and the Kaga and the Soryu, and that line is not theoretical. It is real, even though no one planned it, even though no one could have predicted it, even though the men who died making it possible never knew what they had accomplished. This is something that military historians talk about when they talk about what combat actually looks like as opposed to what it looks like in plans and briefings and documentaries. In real combat, victory is almost never produced by a single brilliant decision or a single heroic act. It is produced by the accumulation of dozens of smaller acts, many of them costly, many of them seemingly unsuccessful in the moment, which together create conditions that no one fully anticipated. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 did not lose their lives in vain, but neither did they consciously sacrifice themselves for the greater good. They flew the mission they were given and they died, and the fact that their deaths contributed to the greatest American naval victory of the war is something that happened to them and through them, not something they chose. The third thing I want to sit with for a moment is what Midway meant to Japan, because this is often the part of the story that gets the least attention, and it is in some ways the most human part of it. The Japanese officers who survived Midway came home to a country that did not know what had happened. Yamamoto and Nagumo and the other senior officers involved in the operation were kept in isolation on their return to Japan. The loss of the 4 carriers was classified at the highest level. The surviving crew of the sunken carriers were transferred to other postings without being allowed to return to their home ports, and were specifically forbidden from discussing what had happened with anyone, including their own families. The Japanese public was told that the Battle of Midway was a Japanese victory. Think about what this means. The sailors who had watched their ships burn, who had seen their comrades die, who knew the truth of what had happened, were required to carry that truth in silence. Some of them carried it for the rest of their lives. Nagumo himself became a changed man, the confidence and authority that had made him the natural choice to command the carrier striking force replaced by something quieter and darker. He continued to command, continued to fight, but the battles after Midway never went well for him either. And at the Battle of Saipan in 1944, as American forces landed on the island he was defending, he took his own life. Yamamoto's end came a year after Midway, in April 1943, when American codebreakers once again provided intelligence that made a specific operation possible, this time the details of his inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. American P-38 Lightnings, briefed with precise information about his flight schedule and route, intercepted his transport aircraft and shot it down over the jungle of Bougainville. The man who planned Pearl Harbor, who designed the Midway operation, who perhaps more than any other single individual set in motion the chain of events that led to the Pacific War, died in a burning aircraft in the jungle, his death itself the product of the intelligence war that he had, at Midway, already lost. The broader lesson of Midway, the one that runs through all of these individual stories and all of these individual decisions, is really about the relationship between preparation and fortune. At Midway, the Americans had prepared as well as they possibly could given the time and resources available to them. Rockefeller's team had worked themselves half to death breaking the Japanese code. The Yorktown's repair crew had performed something close to a miracle. Nimitz had made bold, decisive choices about positioning his force. The American pilots had trained for exactly the kinds of attacks they were asked to carry out. And yet the battle could still have gone differently at a dozen different points. If McCluskey had turned back instead of searching. If the Tone search plane had launched on time and found the American carriers earlier. If the Zero Combat Air Patrol had been at altitude when the dive bombers arrived. If the Yorktown had not been repaired in time to participate. Any one of these factors, any different decision at any one of these moments, might have changed the outcome. This is what military historians mean when they say that no battle is inevitable. Preparation creates the conditions for victory. It does not guarantee it. The men and women who broke the Japanese code prepared the condition. The workers who repaired the Yorktown in 72 hours prepared the condition. Nimitz's decision to send his carriers forward prepared the condition. And then, on the morning of June 4, 1942, the preparation met the moment, and the moment turned, and history turned with it. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the Battle of Midway before we close, and it comes from a letter that Ensign George Gay wrote after the war, after he had spent years processing what he had survived and what he had witnessed from that floating seat cushion in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, wrote about watching the Japanese carriers burn from the water, watching the smoke rise against the blue sky, watching men he had known and flown with and eaten breakfast with that morning die in the space of a few terrible minutes. He wrote about the strange, survivor's guilt that never entirely left him, the knowledge that he was alive and 30 of his comrades were not, and the inability to explain, even to himself, why that was. He spent years after the war speaking about Torpedo Squadron 8, speaking about John Waldron and the men who flew with him, trying to make sure that their sacrifice was not forgotten in the shadow of the famous dive and the famous 6 minutes. Because that is the thing about Midway that gets lost in the story of the 6 minutes and the turned tide. It was won by preparation and intelligence and bold command, yes. But it was also paid for, in part, by men who flew into the impossible and did not come back. The victory belongs to the dive bombers and to the codebreakers. But it was bought, in part, by the torpedo squadrons. And both things are true at the same time. The Battle of Midway is often described as the turning point of the Pacific War, and in a structural sense that is accurate. But I would ask you to think about it less as a turning point and more as a threshold. Before Midway, the Pacific War was Japan's to lose. After Midway, it was America's to win. The actual winning still took 3 more years. It still cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It still required the island battles and the submarine campaign and the massive industrial mobilization of American factories and shipyards working around the clock to produce the ships and planes and tanks and ammunition that the war demanded. None of that was eliminated by what happened on June 4, 1942. But all of that was made possible by what happened on June 4, 1942. Midway is, at its deepest level, a story about what happens when preparation meets opportunity. It is a story about the difference between good intelligence and no intelligence, about the difference between a commander willing to act decisively on uncertain information and one who hesitates. It is a story about the courage of men who fly into situations where the mathematics of survival are against them and fly anyway, not out of ignorance of the odds, but out of something that we sometimes call duty, and sometimes call loyalty, and sometimes call love for the people standing beside them. And it is a story about how the tide of history, which so often seems to move with the enormous, impersonal force of an ocean current, can be turned, if only for 6 minutes, by the right people in the right place making the right decision at the right moment. The world those men flew into no longer exists. The ships are on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The carriers, the Akagi and the Kaga and the Soryu and the Hiryu, were found by deep-sea explorers decades later, lying in the darkness miles below the surface, their flight decks still visible, the shapes of the aircraft that never got to fly still faintly discernible in the wreckage. The Yorktown was found as well, resting at the bottom of the Pacific with some of the personal belongings of the crew still inside, preserved by the cold and the dark. Those men are mostly gone now too. The last of the Midway veterans, the men who flew those missions and crewed those ships, have almost all passed. What remains is the record they left, the decisions they made, the courage they demonstrated in an ocean far from home in a battle that the world had not yet learned to see as decisive. They did not know they were changing history. They were trying, in the most immediate and desperate sense possible, just to survive it. They did not all survive. But those who did, and those who died in the attempt, left behind something that no amount of time can take away. A moment of 5 minutes, or 6, depending on whose account you read, that changed the entire trajectory of the greatest conflict in human history. Remember that the next time someone tells you that one person cannot make a difference, or one decision, or one flight across an empty ocean in an aircraft that should not have made it as far as it did. The Pacific is wide. History is long. But sometimes, in the space of a few extraordinary minutes, the whole thing turns. Now, here is the question I want to leave you with. Given everything you have heard today, given the role that intelligence played, that code-breaking played, that the work of men sitting in a basement in Pearl Harbor played in determining the outcome of the Battle of Midway, do you think the battle could have been won without Rockefort and his team? Could American courage and American carriers alone, without the intelligence advantage, have turned the tide the same way? Or was it the information, rather than the valor, that truly decided Midway? Leave your answer in the comments below, because this is a debate that historians have been having for decades, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story moved you the way it has moved me, there is one simple thing I would ask you to do right now. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every week we go deep into the stories of naval history and air power that changed the world, the battles, the decisions, the men and women behind them. You found this channel for a reason. Stay with us.